Hey everybody, I'm Jonathan Small, and this is Right About Now.
Right about now. One, two, three, hit man.
Right about now. Right about now. The Funk Soul Brother.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Michael Ian Black is here. He is going to join us in just a minute. Michael is a comedian and an actor and a writer. He recently released a new book, which is called A Better Man, a mostly serious letter to my son. In the book, he writes a very thoughtful and personal and often funny letter to his son about the complicated meaning of masculinity in our times. And he is really trying to challenge a lot of the outdated assumptions that society seems to impose upon boys and their place in the world. And let's face it, we're both raising sons, Michael and I, as many of you are, and both of our sons are named Elijah, coincidentally. But raising a kid in the age of the angry white male, in the age of mass school shootings, insurrections at the Capitol, gun violence, all the Me Too outrage, gender issues, is challenging. And Michael set out to write a book to his son before he started college, but really it's a book that he wrote for himself. And I usually don't like books like this. I'm not a big fan of what it means to be a man type books, but he definitely caught my attention, and it's a very surprisingly well-researched book. It's something that he really took a deep dive into. It's not something that he just wrote off the top of his head. And so Michael and I go deep. We talk about his own rather unusual upbringing and how it led him to do what he does today. We talk about this concept of toxic masculinity. We talk about the shortcomings of traditional masculinity and what people think it means to be a man. We talk about the complications of dating in today's minefield. And ultimately, we talk about what it means to be a better man. Now, if you're not familiar with him, Michael started his career with a sketch comedy show called The State, which premiered on MTV in the early 90s. Since then, he's created and starred in many other TV shows and appeared in numerous VH1 I Love The series. His movie appearances include Wet Hot American Summer, The Baxter, and Sextuplets. Michael is also the author of several children's books and books for adults, including the memoirs You're Not Doing It Right and Navel Gazing. He has nearly 2 million Twitter followers. So hopefully he tweets this podcast out and I go viral, baby. All right. Spoken like a true annoying male. Michael Ian Black, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
And thank you for writing your book. It was a really good listen. I actually listened to it. I would take walks and my little sort of afternoon walk and have you in my ears for an hour or so. And so I feel like I know you even though we don't know each other because you were just in my head there for a few days. And it was funny and funny and obviously not funny at points too. It was very poignant and you're even good at 1.5 speed. Let's get into it. So why did you write this book? I mean, it's an interesting book. In some ways, I felt like you wrote it for your son, obviously, but it also felt like in some ways, maybe you were writing it for yourself as well, right? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It started after the Parkland shootings in Florida a couple of years ago.
Here's what we know at this hour. At least 17 people have been killed, students and adults. At least 15 injured, and the shooter, 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz, is in custody. This is the 18th school shooting already this year. It is just mid-February.
And I had been a very vocal critic of the gun lobby, particularly the NRA. And when that happened, I went on a little Twitter rant about it, as I often do. Mm-hmm. But this time, instead of just talking about the gun aspect of it, which is a big part of it, I started asking about the male aspect of it, asking why it's always boys and young men who pull the trigger. which wasn't something I'd ever heard anybody really talking about maybe because it was too obvious. Like I'd never really thought about it. We always just assume it's going to be a guy because it always is. Why? So I wrote that Twitter screed and then, didn't forget about it, but just put it down. And then the next day, the New York Times contacted me and asked if I wanted to write an op-ed about it. And I was like, I don't know, like, who am I? I'm just a jerk off on TV. I don't think I should do that. And they were like, yeah, but we're the New York Times. And I was like, yeah, I guess so. So
like, whatever.
they appealed to my ego. So I was like, all right, I'll try this, but I'm not promising it'll be any good. So I wrote it, they published it, people passed it around, and then a publisher asked me if I wanted to write a book expanding on it. And I was like, I don't know. Like, honestly, I really don't know. I'm just a jerk off on TV. I'm not qualified to write about the subject of masculinity and violence and all of this stuff that I'd been thinking about for a long time, but had never really cohered into anything. I don't know if that's a verb.
I'll look it up after.
Please do. And then my wonderful editor and publisher, she wasn't at the time, but Betsy said, yeah, but why not you? You have a son. Why not you?
Yeah.
And I didn't really have a good answer to that. I was like, yeah, I guess nobody's really writing the things that I'm thinking about, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe they are in a kind of academic world, but not in the layman's world. And because I have a son, but at the time he was a senior in high school, and it just kind of made sense to address it to him and to talk about all these things to him, a conversation that I've been having with myself for these many years, and a conversation that I wish I'd been able to have with my own dad years ago. He died when I was 12. And that's how it began. I wish there was a quicker answer to that question.
No, it's a great answer. And it's a hard book to write because
Tell me about it.
Yeah, exactly. And not only is it a hard book to write in general, but also you had to kind of straddle this whole issue of white privilege, right? You didn't want to cry, oh, look at us, poor white privileged men. You didn't want to sort of apologize for who you are. You also want to acknowledge that we don't have it as hard as some other men growing up in this society of ours.
Yeah, I was really conscious of that and careful about it in terms of how I approached it. I'm very clear in the book. I'm talking to my son, who is a privileged white kid who grew up in relative wealth in the wilds of Connecticut. On paper, we got nothing to complain about.
Right.
And I fully understand that. At the same time, everybody has challenges. Everybody has things they need to mull over. And there are challenges that I think are present for boys right now that deserve consideration, regardless of where they come from. I think boys and young men face a different set of challenges than maybe we did 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And I thought it was worth addressing.
You mentioned your dad passing away, and I was very interested in the part of the book that was your own childhood, because it obviously informs how you're raising your own son now and how you think about masculinity. So can you tell our readers our listeners a little bit about your childhood? You grew up in New Jersey, right? You said you lost your dad. I think he was only 39. Mm-hmm. You were 13. Mm-hmm. And that led to you being raised by your mom. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the domestic situation in your household?
Sure. My parents, I was being raised by my mom before he died when I was 5, and they divorced because, they were not particularly well suited to begin with, but my mom fell in love with the woman down the street, and that tends to have a negative effect on marriage. So
really?
So they split up. My mom and her partner raised the 4 of us. My mom had 3 kids and her partner had 1 in a little townhouse in New Jersey. We still saw my dad every other weekend or so. And the environment in our house was bad. I'm all for whatever relationship you want to have. But this was an abusive relationship. I mean, it was emotionally and verbally abusive. And that really infected the whole household. A lot of that anger in the household was directed not just inward, but outward. And my mom and her partner, I keep saying her partner, I call her Elaine, which isn't her name, but she's still alive. And I don't want to talk about her by name.
Right.
But my mom and Elaine they had a lot of anger towards, and rightly so, I think, in a lot of ways, towards the culture and towards men. And I think they both felt like they had missed opportunities in their lives largely because of their genders.
Right.
And that might be true. But their misinjury, which it was at times, affected me. It affected me as a boy growing up in that household, feeling like, oh, geez, if all men are male chauvinist pigs, what am I going to be? You know? And that worried me.
Yeah.
And continued to worry me as I matured, as I became an adult.
Right.
Continues to worry me to this day.
Yeah. That's tough. And also, what was your dad like before he passed away? As a dad, was he available? Was he present?
He was a good guy, a sensitive guy, who was not a particularly good father. Because he just was not available physically at times, because he worked a lot, emotionally, really not much at all. And he didn't know how to communicate with children. You know, he just didn't know how to be at ease with his own kids, or even, I suspect, with himself. And as I entered adolescence, I started feeling like, oh, I can talk to him a little bit. I just felt like the communication was getting a little bit better. And that's when he died. So it just sucked, because I needed him. I needed a guy in my life. I needed a male figure. And when he died, that was kind of it. Like, I didn't really have anybody else.
So growing up in this environment with a lot of man bashing in your household and your dad not there to speak to about all these things, how do you think that led to sort of, and you've probably worked on this in therapy, as we all have, right? To become who you are, certainly professionally, like you became a comedian. And do you think a lot of that had to do with your reaction to what was going on in your life, and that was the way you were able to deal with it? Aside from the fact that you're just a funny guy, did you want to be an actor? Or?
I'm sure. I mean, I never set out to be a comedian. That was never my goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I'd be a serious actor. I thought I would just go around the country doing plays in regional theaters and be poor and survive. I never thought like I'd have a career telling jokes in front of a camera, on stage, anything like that. But in retrospect, yeah, I mean, every guy learns to armor up in some way. Every person probably does too. But for men, we understand at a pretty young age that we have to present strength. We have to appear invulnerable in some capacity. And a lot of us can't do that physically. I couldn't. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a gorgeous man, but I could not.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, don't sell yourself short.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's been hard for me. It's been hard for me doing this interview, frankly.
But I had to find a way to be strong. And the way I could be strong was with my sense of humor.
Right.
And by being deadpan and sarcastic. And that eventually turned into a career for me, which was surprising.
Yeah. So the career happened. I mean, I think I remember first hearing about you with The State.
That is very funny. Hi there. I'm an on-air personality. You know, after a tough day shooting my hit television series, The State, there's nothing I enjoy more than having some unprotected sex. Not only do those orgasms feel terrific, but afterwards, I fall right to sleep. Hey, it's better than taking pills. Just kidding. And when it's unprotected sex, hey man, that's when things really start to swing. Not only do I risk impregnating my underage partners, but think about all those spooky diseases. Ouch.
That was kind of your big breakout where you had this sketch comedy team that was from NYU originally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some good connections and good talent got you guys a look at Central.
It was MTV.
MTV, it was MTV, sorry. Viacom, something Viacom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of how you accidentally became a comic, right? Or became more known as a comedian.
Yeah, we started this college comedy club at NYU and ended up a few years later with our own television show on MTV. And that was the beginning of my professional life, other than, I think, one scene that I did on NYPD Blue, where I played a gay Puerto Rican street hustler, as you do. As you do.
All right. So during this period of your life, you are having a lot of success. Did you ever think that you wanted to be a parent? I mean, was there ever a time when you're like, I'm ready to settle down and be a parent? Or were you just kind of like a lot of us guys were like, I'm just happy having a wife or whatever, or a girlfriend. I don't need to have kids, Or did you want to have kids?
I think my wife and I both sort of felt like it wasn't so much that either of us were like dying to have kids, but it felt like not like an obligation. So we got married relatively young for our age, for our friend group. I was like 27, which was pretty young for that group of people that I was hanging out with. And nobody was thinking about having kids at that time. But I think we both sort of felt like, you know what? We probably will want kids at some point. So why not do it now when we're young enough that when they're grown, we'll still be relatively young and we can have a whole other part of our lives. So we sort of went into it from a purely like pragmatic point of view, almost like, let's just get this over with.
Yeah, right. And when you found out it was a boy, were you sort of like, oh man, given your history with boys and being a boy yourself, and like you said, you used a good word. What's the opposite of misogyny, right?
Misinjury.
Misinjury. A new word that I'm excited to know now. Were you kind of like, oh God, a boy, this is going to be tricky?
Yeah, I was really worried about it.
Yeah.
I mean, because I felt more confident in my ability to raise a girl than a boy, because I'd been raised by women. A lot of my friends growing up had been girls for the reasons that we talked about. And I thought I'm going to screw this up with a boy.
Yeah. I
thought I'm not going to know what to say or do. And what if my boy is so unlike me that I can't relate? I think it's probably all the worries that parents have. But yeah, when he turned out to be a boy, I definitely had a pang of terror, in addition to the pang of terror of just being a parent. And I soon realized that was misplaced because I was bigger than him.
So you could sit on him if he acted up. Has he exceeded you in height now?
Oh yeah. Not by a lot, but enough that it's noticeable and annoying.
Yeah, annoying. Yeah, when you realize that your son suddenly can beat you up, it's a whole other. My son is 15 and he's 6'3", and I'm only 6 feet, so it's a little intimidating. What is it that you wanted to teach him? You spend a lot of time in your book talking about the sort of shortcomings of traditional masculinity and why it doesn't work and what we sort of traditionally think of to be a man. What do you think in your research and you're really going deep within yourself, what do you think about traditional manhood has failed you and fails so many of us growing up?
As much time as I talk about how traditional masculinity doesn't work,
mm-hmm.
I think I spend an equal amount of time, or maybe less, but a fair amount of time also talking about how it does work,
mm-hmm.
that there are a lot of attributes in traditional masculinity that I continue to celebrate. Strength is a good thing, can be a good thing. Independence can be a good thing,
Right.
Fortitude can be a really good thing. Like all of those are traditionally masculine qualities that I have no problem with. But it's also easy to see how a narrowly defined version of strength can become limiting and dangerous, how too much independence can be limiting and dangerous, and the inability to ask for help or acknowledge the need of community can be limiting and dangerous. So it's not so much that I want to dispense with traditional masculinity as I want to broaden what we think of when we think of men. I want to expand the idea of masculinity so that guys feel not only okay about needing other people, about wanting to be empathetic, about showing vulnerability, about demonstrating kindness and gentleness, but that we're celebrated for it. And in the same way that we celebrate now girls who show strength, girls who are fierce, girls who get out there and can do anything. We've elevated those same qualities of traditional masculinity now in women and girls, but we haven't done the same for boys and the attributes that are traditionally feminine. And it's costing us.
It's confusing, I think, for boys to know what to be right now.
Totally.
Because if you're too strong, you might come across as a bully or the sort of stereotypical male, but you also don't want to be, weak. How do you think it's changed since when we were kids? And I'm assuming we're around the same age.
I'm 26.
You're 26, right? So I'm 28. So we're close.
Okay.
How has it changed from when we were kids coming up in the day to our kids growing up in sort of this internet culture? And you think it's trickier? There's even more minefields to go through?
Yeah, I think some aspects of it are trickier. Some aspects of it are easier. I think in general, the culture has become more welcoming of different types of people so that a boy like me growing up today might feel more supported. I grew up in New Jersey, as you said, in the 80s, and it was a culture like you think of when you think of New Jersey culture in the 80s. I mean, it was big hair and...
Hey, listen, I went to Action Park. I mean, I know it. I grew up in Westchester County.
Okay.
My father's from New Jersey, so I'm hip to it. Yeah.
I mean, it was Bruce Springsteen and John Bon Jovi. I mean, that was kind of the vibe where I grew up. And there wasn't a lot of space there for boys like me who didn't want to be that, who wanted to do something or be something kind of different. I had a hard time even articulating what that was. I didn't know what it was I was looking for exactly. I just knew it wasn't what I was growing up with. But I think today there's just more resources. There's more people that you can kind of look to. You can get on TikTok or YouTube and see people who maybe you identify with more. I think that aspect of it has gotten better. On the other hand, I do think there's clearly a lot of minefields with social media. There's clearly a lot of minefields with behavior that maybe could have been a one-off or an isolated event or something that you got slapped on the wrist for as a young person that now may live forever and now may affect you in unforeseeable ways. That's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to feel like your entire life is public. And I suspect a lot of young people feel that way, boys and girls.
You're sort of talking about the cancel culture thing that's happening now. And that even applies not just to public figures like yourself, who have big Twitter feeds, but even our kids. Yeah. We were just talking about this the other day in the car with the kids, like they're so scared of being canceled and they know that all the people they follow on TikTok, et cetera, are terrified of being canceled. That's like the biggest fear they have. And this idea, I mean, you couldn't be canceled by society when we were growing up.
No, I mean, you'd have to kill somebody and have a very public trial.
Yeah.
For that to happen.
Yeah. So that's tricky. The other thing that I think is I can't quite get my head around is what it would be like to be in a relationship now and to date as a teenager, college kid. And you do have advice in there about dating. Tell me what your thoughts are on what your advice was to your son about navigating relationships in this time.
My advice to him is pretty straightforward and simple. And it doesn't just apply to relationships. To sexual relationships, romantic relationships. It applies to all relationships, which is be as straightforward and communicative as you can be. There is absolutely nothing wrong, and in fact, everything right with the idea of informed consent, of saying to somebody, particularly when you're in a new relationship, you're just dating somebody, the boundaries are a little fuzzy, there's not a lot of clarity yet in the relationship. I don't think there's anything wrong at the end of the night with saying, "May I kiss you?" as opposed to just going in for the kiss. I think that's okay, and I don't think you lose anything by communicating that. If anything, you gain. I mean, if she says yes, fabulous. If she says no, that's going to sting.
Mm-hmm.
But you're going to avoid
the
potential of a problem.
Yeah, and extremely uncomfortable. All right, let's talk about some of the facets of a better man, sort of now and forever, because these are universal things. These are things that hopefully men can carry on over the decades and centuries. And a lot of these are the opposite of some of the men that we've seen storming the Capitol. Sorry, not to bring in politics this conversation, but sometimes when I see some of the images of men on television in the last few days, I'm like, that is not what I want to raise as a man. You talk a lot about empathy, the importance of empathy and the importance of love. And these are not always words that are associated with masculinity. Mm-hmm. Was there anything in your thinking about this that surprised you to be, this is a quality of a man? Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about this, but this is a very important thing that I want to pass on to my son and to my readers about what it means to be a man.
I was afraid of talking about love in particular because it seems so gooey mm-hmm. and sentimental, and I don't even know gooey.
But all you need is love.
Right, baby. All you need is love. But the more I started thinking about it and reading about it, the more I came to believe, and now I'm going to quote Huey Lewis, because you just quoted the Beatles, in The Power of Love, which is to actually put the emphasis on that word power and think about the kind of strength that it requires to not only choose to love somebody, but to allow them to love you. Because what that necessitates is you dropping whatever you've armored yourself up with. You can't receive somebody else's love if you're totally insulated emotionally. You just can't. And so taking off that armor, even for one person, requires, I think, a lot of strength. What? My dog's about to throw up. Come here, outside.
Uh-oh.
He's in pre-throw up mode, and I unlocked the doorway.
He's in pre-throw up. All this talk about love, your dog is like, dude.
Yeah, he's like, barf. I don't blame him. But there's a lot of strength that's required. And it's easier for guys, I think, to stay invulnerable than to show their vulnerability. I mean, if you get into a fight with somebody, you're at a lot more risk, if you're just wearing a loincloth than if you're in full gladiator garb. And so I wanted to frame love as an act of strength, empathy as an act of strength.
Humility was another one.
Yeah, because they really are. They require a lot of trust in yourself and a lot of belief that you can weather whatever pain showing that side of yourself may bring. And it will bring pain. It has to.
And sometimes these things are put on us by society, but sometimes they're put on us by women that we know, kind of expecting they also are maybe falling for some of the stereotypes of what a man should be, right?
That's my point. My point is to blame the women.
Yeah, you got to blame the women. In fact, if anything, I want people to take away from this is that women are horrible people.
Well, women in the culture are in the culture. We're all susceptible to all of these ideas. We're all raised with them. We all swim in the same water. So I do think women need to think about their own relationships with men and what they really want from men. Because I think for a lot of men, part of the fear of showing that vulnerability is fearing that when they do, the women in their lives will reject them, will think that they're weak.
Yeah.
And I understand that. I understand that fear.
Yep. You know, if I'm a young dad listening to this interview and I'm wondering, well, okay, my son is only like 2 or 3 at this point, so he doesn't have these considerations and he's at this point just wreaking havoc. And you've learned this over your course of raising 2 kids, but how do you raise a kid to have these values that you're talking about? Because a lot of times when you talk to kids about this is how you should be, they're sort of like, I know, Dad. If I have tried to have that conversation with my son now, who's 15, and he's a little bit in the I know everything phase, is it more be an example to your son of these things and hope that he picks up on these qualities? I mean, it's not a perfect science. What advice do you give to young dads kind of to impart these kinds of lessons to their kid?
I think modeling behavior is the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
I think it's ultimately the most effective, because anybody can talk a good game, but if they see that you're full of shit, they're going to reject you or reject your advice. I think you have to model good behavior. And I think when you model bad behavior, as we all do, we have to then follow that with either an acknowledgement, an apology, communication.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all fuck up.
Mess up, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
No, I think that's important. That's part of being humble, right? To admit that you made a mistake and like, yeah, I kind of lost it a little bit there.
yeah, of course,
Or whatever. I said something I shouldn't have said
of course.
to that driver who cut me off. Yeah.
And I think part of it is not beating ourselves up too much about it, acknowledging to ourselves that we screwed up and figuring out a way to try to do better the next time. I mean, you said in the beginning, you thought this book was as much to me as my son. I would say it's probably 70-30 to me.
Mm.
You know, it started out 100% to my son. It ended up being,
Right. A letter too.
yeah.
Slowly but surely. Well, you also did a lot of research. Like, it's not just your musings. It's like a well-researched book. So it obviously was an interest of yours and you really dug deep.
Well, I didn't feel like I could write it without at least some foundation in the literature.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know where to look. Honestly, it started with me just Googling good books about men and just being pretty scattershot in my approach. And then over time, I found things that spoke to me more. And some of it wasn't just about men. A lot of it was about women. A lot of it was just about, we talked about love. Some of it was just about love and what is it and how do we express it? Some of it was about happiness. What is happiness?
Right.
It wasn't just academic stuff about the history of men or gender theory or anything like that. Some of it was.
I mean, you've become a bit of a scholar in this now. You could go teach a course.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Oh, God.
Don't even say that. Don't even go there.
I mean, unless there's a good fee involved, in which case, yeah, I'm an expert.
Did your son read the book?
He's read some of it.
Right. I mean, my kid won't listen to 3 minutes of my podcast. So
Why would he?
yeah, exactly. Like, it's embarrassing. Do your kids watch your, shows, your old state? Never. Not interested.
I think, first of all, I'm not interested in them seeing it. Not because I'm embarrassed or anything, but because I don't want to be anything to them other than dad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't need them to see me on TV. I don't need them to see, not that I can get a job now anyway. I can't. But
Are you saying that comedy wise, or is that true? Is it tough for you to get a job?
well, right now show business is closed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well,
and middle-aged white dudes aren't in particular high demand right now in showbiz, if you can believe it.
That is probably correct. Well, you did find writing, which is also probably a little bit trickier now. But in fact, you've been writing for a while. This is not your first book. You've written some children's books.
No.
Right? You've written a lot of things. Why did you begin writing, and how did that come into your professional life?
I've always kind of written without really realizing I was writing. Like, I used to write funny little things to sort of entertain myself. Didn't really think about it very much. But when the state started, we had to learn how to write. If you wanted to be in a sketch, you had to write it basically because the person who wrote it was in charge of casting it.
Yeah.
We didn't have a director who would be like, okay, you do this, you do that. If the group wanted to do it and you wrote it, you would just cast yourself in the starring role.
Yep.
So that's where I started writing more seriously, professionally. And then obviously we ended up with a TV show and I had to generate a lot of writing. That turned into longer form television shows, some screenplays. And I always knew I wanted to write a book, but I didn't know how to begin. And my first book is called My Custom Van and 50 Other Mind-Blowing Essays That Will Blow Your Mind All Over Your Face. And it was kind of like a kindergarten book for me. It was just short little essays that I felt like I could tackle one at a time.
Right.
I could do this. And I knew if I was going to write another book, it would have to be like a real book. And so the next book I wrote was called You're Not Doing It Right, True Tales of Sex, Marriage, and Other Humiliations, something like that.
You have good subtitles.
Yeah.
It's all in the subtitle for you.
And that was the first sort of more long form, quasi-serious thing that I wrote. And then I've written several other books since then.
Do you enjoy it, or is writing like painful for you?
Both. I think it can be excruciating, as every writer knows. It can be just horrendous as you're just staring at the screen, trying to think of anything to say about anything and feeling wrung out and useless and like a fraud. But then, you know, over the slow accumulation of words on a page, it still feels awful. It still feels awful. And then a couple of years later, when you look at the finished product, you go, oh yeah, that wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find ways to make writing more enjoyable. And I think the experiment that I'm doing right now, and it seems to be working, is to write very quickly and almost thoughtlessly and see if you can progress that way and not worry really about the results until later. That has made it more fun for me. But I don't know if what I'm writing is even readable. I don't know if it's anything, but it's kind of an experiment.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with morning pages. Have you heard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it reminds me of the morning pages where you're just sort of getting it out there without judging, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not free form. You're not just writing anything that's in your head.
No, I'm trying to write a novel because it's something I've always wanted to do.
Right.
And I have no confidence in my ability to do that. Zero. But yeah, I'm trying to just do it.
Right. But you're trying not to judge yourself. You're just doing it. Do you work with an outline, or you have a general idea in your head of where you want it to go?
I tried writing a novel once before where I outlined it and spent weeks and weeks and weeks outlining it, months maybe, and then basically abandoned it. This time, I have a kind of rough idea where it's heading. I don't know yet how it ends, but I'm letting it kind of unfold, knowing that the process of doing it this way will create much more work for me later, but feeling like maybe it's worth it if I can get a first draft done. Because I feel like if I can get a first draft done, that's all I need. I can rewrite forever.
Yeah.
And that doesn't pain me. It's the first draft that I think is just the hardest, worst thing.
Can we talk about your Twitter for a minute? Because you have a very, we can't.
Oh, I mean, yes, of course.
You have a huge Twitter following, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just looked up 1.9 million followers. First of all, how did this happen? Do you have any idea? Have you ever thought about how this happened? I know that
I totally know how it happened. And it's a bullshit number. It's a totally bullshit number because I got into Twitter early, right before it really took off. And so I was one of the early comedians who was using the platform in ways that I think were slightly different, slightly more out of the box. And Twitter liked what I was doing with it. And so they put me basically on their like comedians page. And so when people were joining, right when the explosion of Twitter happened, people were just sort of following me almost automatically.
Yeah.
That's where the bulk of that number came from.
Right.
Like 90% of those people probably don't have Twitter accounts anymore or don't even look at them. You know, the actual number of people who engage with me on Twitter, or not even engage, but like actually actively look at my Twitter, has got to be 10% of that.
Yeah.
Which is still pretty good.
Still 10% of 1.9 million is a lot bigger than my Twitter.
Yeah, I might be way overestimating.
Do you feel because you have this relatively large platform, even though maybe it's exaggerated, does your Twitter make you a little bit nervous? Do you feel like you really have to be careful about what you post there?
I didn't for a long time. The opposite was true. I was cavalier about it because I felt like the pugnacious part of me was like, fuck it, I don't care. I'm just going to write whatever I want. I don't care if it's offensive. I don't care if I use language that isn't PC.
Yeah.
The Twitter culture was different then, and the larger culture was different then. As crazy as it sounds. I mean, I've probably been on 7, 8, 10 years. I don't know how long I've been on Twitter, but
says since 2009. So yeah, you're an early adopter.
Yeah. So, and I also thought naively that people would give me the benefit of the doubt. If I wrote something that they thought was offensive, I thought they would understand my sense of humor, that I was either being sarcastic or purposely offensive for the sake of making a point, like whatever it was. And that was dumb. Like that was really dumb of me, because as we see how the platform evolved and how the culture evolved, all of those, what I thought were sort of innocent jokes, became fodder for attacks.
Yeah.
Became really effective weapons that you could wield against me.
Yeah.
And when that happened, it was really confusing and kind of devastating.
Yeah.
Speaking of cancel culture. So I've been through the ringer on that a couple times. I mean, more than once. It was, and
I don't want to bring up any, I didn't even know that you had been attacked in that way. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, I've been dragged many times, sometimes correctly, by the way.
Right. And this is probably for things maybe you even wrote like early on, right? Not even current. They'll go back.
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of it was for stuff that like I wrote early on, where like comedians were like almost trying to out offend each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was common. That was super common. That stuff I don't even feel particularly bad about, because I understood the intention of it. The times where it's like been painful is when I fucked up, really made a mistake and had to own it. And talking about the humility and the strength required to apologize, it's hard to do that in front of a few million people.
And sometimes it's not enough anyway. So it's kind of like,
oh, no, it's never enough. Any apology that you give will be met with derision and contempt and further outrage. But my friend John Roderick is dealing with this right now. He wrote this Twitter thread, which went viral very quickly. He became known as Bean Dad almost immediately. This story that he related about not being willing to open a can of beans for his 9-year-old daughter. And he was relating what he thought was a funny story, which he was exaggerating. And then very quickly, it turned into a thing where he was guilty of child abuse and he was this monster. And they brought up...
because he wouldn't open a can of beans for his daughter.
Yeah, it was the way, it was the way he told the story.
Yeah.
And then they quickly found old tweets of his where he was using offensive language, as I did, like in parody. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it devastated him, and he deactivated his account and he wrote an apology. And
yeah,
it's,
is it worth it? I mean, is it even worth it?
In some ways it is.
Mm-hmm.
There have been times where I've gone through it where it forces you to take a hard look at yourself and go, well, wait a minute. I thought I was doing one thing and I thought I was one kind of person and I thought I was making a certain kind of point. And maybe I got all of that wrong. Maybe I was not only being inelegant in my words, but maybe my thought process about something or another is flawed. And maybe it is worth taking a step back and looking at my own words and actions and reflecting on whether that does demand some change. it can be helpful. It's painful as fuck, but it can be helpful. And I think the couple times that I've gone through it, in the end, it has served me. That being said, it sucks. It really sucks.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a lot to think about every time you post. Like, how is this going to be received? You're always censoring yourself. Can't quite be free to say whatever you feel what's on your mind.
No, but the good thing about it, I think, is that it makes you more thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have an impulse to write something and you go, if you just take that half a beat and you go, well, wait a minute, how is this going to be read? Is there a better way for me to express the same sentiment without stepping on that particular landmine? Then that's probably a good thing. I think it ultimately might make you a better writer.
Yeah.
But I still do it. I still write things that offend people.
Yeah. This has been really interesting, Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to his podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you may find podcasts. Or you can go to his website, rightaboutnowmedia.com, and listen there. This is Ella, reminding you to do the right thing.
Thanks, Ella.
You're welcome.
Perfect.
Can you listen to it?